Hello, everyone. It's good to see everyone again after so many weeks that I've been very busy with doing, the SwiftUI course, learning about new features in SwiftUI, and also for the past 2 weeks, actually 2.5 weeks, I've been working on this new design because we're preparing for a huge update to DesignCode, and I can't leave my team hanging, so I had to focus on the design and the design system. So because we have a team of early designers and developers, I have to be more participative in terms of how to set the design language, how to communicate with everyone, how to start a template, because otherwise it's very hard to get anywhere. It's very hard to, it's still very abstract for them, right? So my job is to make sure that they understand the vision and the language and how Design Plus Code excels. First of all, I just want to say, thank you so much for subscribing to our YouTube channel. We have reached almost 30,000, which is really cool. YouTube is never something that I thought I would focus on, but after 1.5 years, we managed to get to this number. And I've been sort of experimenting with different kinds of content, publishing some sections from the courses, and we're gonna experiment more, but it seems that the live streams are working, and it seems also that it's complementing well with the format that we already had, so the courses, the paid courses, and the tutorials. So thank you so much for subscribing to us. We're gonna keep creating awesome content for you, and DesignCode itself has grown a lot. We've managed to reach 75,000 paid customers since inception, so that's about 6 years ago. And of course, I was alone for the first sort of four years, and only for the past 2.5 years that I started having a team. So now we have 15 people with us. Again, most of them early designers and developers. So I have to learn how to communicate with everyone. I have to balance with creating courses versus taking care of the team and mentoring them. So this is what I want to teach you. Well, at least this is what I want to give you my insights personally as someone who's been through these kind of things. We have a fair share of success. We're not the next billion-dollar company. We don't want to be the next billion-dollar company, but I'm very, very happy about the growth that we're experiencing right now. So we already have 50,000 MRR, so monthly recurring revenue. And what I'm most proud of is that we have grown from 30K to 50K monthly recurring revenue in about 6 months. So the growth is what I'm most proud of. And the same for the team, the same for the content, and seeing how everyone is creating apps. They are creating, amazing designs themselves, and they're learning. A lot of people send me messages. They're like, hey, I got a new job. I've been creating, someone the other day was telling me that they actually had like a SwiftUI job because of my course. So that makes me really, really proud. And that's exactly what we're going for. And regardless the situation of the world right now, I just want to say that we're here together, and we are proud that we can be here to help people learn online, right? Because of the situation of the pandemic. So it's great that you can sit anywhere in the world with your computer and be able to build an awesome app or an awesome website. So thank you again. Now, today is a really big topic. It's about design systems in particular, but most importantly, it's about working with teams, right? Sometimes people are a little bit too trigger happy in terms of creating a design system, but nobody uses it. And I think that's kind of like a shame, because the goal of the design system is for everyone to be on board. It's for everyone to start using the same components, the same icons, the same buttons, and the same code. And at Design Plus Code, we have about 50% designers, 50% developers. It's very important for us that everyone is on the same page. And in a good day, you're gonna see about 5 or 6 people online at the same time on the Figma file. And if you look at the entire Figma file, you can see that we have the entire experience for DesignCode.io. So the question is, how do we get everyone in sync? And I want to dial back a little bit and speak about the problem, right? 10 years ago, designers were mostly creating style guides. So what is a style guide? A style guide is basically a sort of watered down version of the styles that you see right here. There's no components, there's no commenting system, there's no live collaboration. A style guide is basically saying, hey, these are the colors, these are the fonts, these are the different design templates that we're using, and that's about 10 years ago. But as you know, designers and design tools have become more sophisticated, solving harder problems. Apps have become, more complex. We have to adapt to so many kinds of devices. We have to work with, so many developers, because the ratio of developers to designers is about 1 to 10. So designers have to, work really well with developers if they want to be valuable at the company. So we are sort of learning a lot from the development tools. So if you look at any design tools out there, they all take inspiration from the coding tools, and vice versa now. But I just want to point out that like a lot of these new features, such as constraints, components, plugins, and text styles, and all of these things are really inspired from the development tools. The same for auto layout in Figma is basically CSS Flex. And so if you want to look at the future, you look at the development tools. So we're talking about VS Code, we're talking about Xcode, we're talking about SwiftUI. And designers have to sort of understand how that works and how that connects with everything. Designers are strong at business. They're strong at UX. They're strong at product design. And the question is, how do you use that strength and make it applicable to the whole flow of development, right? Because all apps are made of code, right? Like you can't avoid that. So how do you leverage your business skills, your design skills, and your UX skills? And you're the one who knows how the layout works. You're the one who knows how the user experience works. And you talk to customers. You talk to the founders and the managers. You have to use those skills and make them connect to the code, right? And so we have so many colors of design systems out there, right? So for the past 5 years, we've looked at so many kinds of tools, starting with, they're like NPM libraries, for example, that can be a design system. So people can just go to their code and, install a bunch of NPM libraries, and then, they're kind of the source of truth. When I say the design system, I mean, what is the source of truth? What is what everyone looks at to do their design or to do their development? And if you're an engineering focused company, you're going to be looking more at, NPM libraries and, code and local components that are, in VS Code, for example. We try really, really hard to create these components so that they're reusable. And, these can be your design system if you're not so much keen on using the design tool. And then there's the middle part. So the middle part I'm talking about tools, especially the newer tools such as plugins and, you know, Brand AI, I believe, or something like that. There's Zero Height. There's a bunch of new tools coming out that basically try to take information from your design tool, put it in a website, and take also the NPM libraries and put it on the same website so that the visual connects to the NPM library or whatever else local components that you have, and then spit the code, and then, you know, everything, the source of truth itself would be on the website. And this is kind of like the most popular scenario that I see nowadays. So, you know, if you look at design systems on Google, you're gonna find like design system repo, and you're gonna see a bunch of design systems out there that kind of put everything and the principles and everything on a website. We also have another one for DesignCode, and I think that's great. This works better if you're a big company and if you have many people that you need to communicate to, right? But the problem with this is that just like a style guide 10 years ago, it can become pretty outdated at some point, right? Especially if you make it out to the public, you don't want to change it, because design is always evolving. So how do you deal with those changes? The code is always evolving, components is always evolving. But how do we deal with those changes? Are you gonna update these websites every time that you change something? And especially if you make it front-facing to the public, like, are they gonna be introduced to those new changes that you made, or are you gonna have your own private website for your internal employees for your design system, right? So those are some of the questions. And by the way, I'm not trying to say that any of these solutions are wrong. I think all of these solutions are good, but I'm just trying to expose the problems and how do we deal with them. So at Design Plus Code, we have tried all of them, and maybe not to the same extensive trial as many big companies, but definitely we have tried some of them or most of them. What I would like to say is that if you want to be a lean startup, if you want to be a lean design team, you want to use as little mediums as possible, right? You want to have to avoid sort of like intermediate tools that is in between the results and the design or the planning. And for us, we don't want to create a website yet. We are still in the first stage of the design system, and we are using Figma, and we are trying. We have tried that for the past 2 weeks, and very successfully. So I want to share with you these techniques that we have learned. So design tools are becoming more and more sophisticated, as I mentioned. Now we can do live collaboration. On a good day, we have like 5-6 people in the team looking at this document in real time. When we make a change, we go through massive rounds of feedback, and even developers can add feedback. They can copy the CSS code. So this is fantastic. You know, if you're a developer and you're not in Figma, you're missing out, because this is going to help you so much. You can go to code and you can get the CSS code from here. Now, if you're making apps, that's another story, because the code that gets exported for, let's say, SwiftUI or for Android or for React Native is definitely not the same. Well, React Native is using CSS, so it's probably going to be fine. But there are definitely techniques that developers use that are not compatible with some of these code that we're using here, such as inline styling that they use in React, for example. If you use that technique, that means that you can't really use this code here. So for us at Design Plus Code, we actually use style components. And the reason why we use style components is that it's kind of like connecting the both worlds. So we can use traditional CSS code, but we also use a library that can use all of those features such as Sass and variables and props. So we want to have the power of sort of the inline styling tools, but we want to use the traditional CSS code. And so it's very helpful. So our developers are basically just copying the code in CSS, especially for backgrounds and border radius, box shadow, all of these things that takes a lot of time to code from scratch for developers. So at the end of the day, they would mostly focus on positioning things and organizing, architecting, and injecting the data. So that's kind of like their role, right? Like they're not here to be responsible of how the drop shadows look or how well it animates. We let them take care more of the architecture. So the data and the API calls and the Redux stuff or context API on all of these new things, or Netlify deploy and PR, merging conflicts and shit like that. Sorry for my French. So yeah, like that's kind of like what they're really, really good at. Now, at Design Plus Code, we try to take it to the next level. So we have actually designers who code, and we want them to code. And the reason why is because developers always have a hard time to sort of like take a design and translate it to the perfection, the way it should be implemented, right? And that's not their fault. That is just they're not trained for that. They're not the one doing the UI. They don't understand how we're organizing all of these auto layout and architecture, the way that we're setting components and the way that we're setting like these border radius and the fill and the selection colors and the effects and they even have a hard time with the assets. Like they don't understand, some of them, especially the junior one, they don't understand the difference between a JPEG or PNG or or SVG versus PDF. So when you have these problems, you have to communicate those well, and you sort of like have to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And one thing that I'm very, very passionate about is to make sure that the people who are designing can be the people that are developing. So especially when it comes to the more static design. So we're talking about landing pages, we're talking about, like very simple stuff. Because in every app, there are complex stuff and there are simple stuff, right? If you think about the simple stuff, we're talking about, like these discounts here, the testimonials, super simple, these logos here. Developers shouldn't even touch these things because this can be done easily by a designer who codes. There's not a lot of data. It's not very dynamic. You can make it dynamic, of course, but let's look at these logos. The question that you have to ask yourself, well, does it really need to be dynamic? Does it really need to have, a backend behind it? A footer or a header. There's a lot of animations, but usually it's mostly the same things. And designers can really excel at adaptive layout, right? They can be creating these designs and then they can sort of imagine how it's going to look like on the iPad and on the iPhone. So someone is asking, is Figma better than Sketch? And I will say that this year, the answer is yes. And the short answer is yes. Now, the reason why is because you want to create a very efficient flow for your entire team. Yes, Figma is free for individuals, but it is paid for teams. Figma is great if you have multiple computers and you're jumping between them quite easily. With Sketch is a pain. Okay? Figma has real-time collaboration. Sketch doesn't have that yet. Figma has, like you can easily invite your team, and you store everything in the clouds. Sketch doesn't have that as well. They have that, but not as well. Figma though has to work online, and Sketch doesn't have to, which is great. I mean, if you don't have the internet, or you have limited internet, of course Figma it's not going to work very well for you. If you have privacy issues and stuff like that, for some companies like Apple, for example, they might not use Figma because they don't want to store anything in the cloud. So you have to look at all these things. But for us, for most companies, this is not a problem at all. Now let's look at the features. So in Figma, we have auto layout, which is the best thing ever. And I use this in every single thing. Everything in my designs are auto layout nowadays. So I have completely changed my design techniques for the way that I'm designing with auto layout. Both tools have constraints. That's great. Both tools have libraries and components and all that stuff. Figma has a bit more efficient, I would say. You don't have to switch back and forth. So there are still really nice tricks in Sketch where in Figma, sorry, where you can edit. So let's say this is an instance of a component. So I can basically go to main component, and then I make the edit. And once I'm done, I can go back. So Sketch has that, but Figma, you can just do everything in the same file. But yeah, generally speaking, if you're talking about design systems, if you're talking about storing everything in the cloud, you don't have to worry about where you're saving your files, sharing on Dropbox. You don't have to worry about all of these team collaboration things. And real-time collaboration is just, it's just so good. If you want to, comment on something specifically, you press C, and then you mention about it to your team. You can sort of like tag them. And, they can see right away, they get an email, and then they go directly to the design file. They make the change. They can, flag it as solved. And that's it, you solve that problem and you move on to the next problem. So someone is asking, have I tried to sync Figma with the code? I haven't. And I wouldn't know how you would do that, honestly. Like, you would probably need like some sort of a plugin that sort of connect to maybe an npm library or something like that, and then that would sync the code. But I haven't seen anything like that. It would be an interesting experiment for sure. But for now, what I can say is that we haven't had problems. We work really, really well with the team. So let's start with the designs. Like I mentioned before, we have a team of early designers, and we have Surya, who started with us a year and a half ago, and he's 17, like a rock star designer, super young, and he's learning really well. But at the same time, he has a hard time creating designs from scratch. And of course, you should never compare yourself to someone who's more senior, who has started hundreds of projects. Of course, they will have an easier time starting a new projects, a new design language, a new template, a new approach. That's totally normal. So my job here is to start this design from scratch. And so once I started from scratch, then I can say, hey, Surya, this is kind of like the organization that I want, the colors that I want, the typography that I want, and then they take it from there. And if you do a good job, then they can create pretty cool pages on their own. So for example, Surya managed to create this page right here, and he was basically using the same sort of the styling for the transparency and the background blur. We make a rule that everyone has to use text styles. Every text have to use text styles. So you can see this is a small text 2. because it is in caps. And you know, Surya has a very easy time creating like the mobile version for it. And you know, we encourage everyone to learn all of these things. And then I asked him to create the updates page. So we're gonna have these giant cards that explains what is new, what are the new courses, what are the new sections, and this is new. So we want to kind of inform our users, well, yes, we have new courses, but what you don't see is the new sections, so the new tutorials, the small pieces of those courses that are new. So we want to add that as a card as well, and then we want to discuss about the different fixes, if there are performance issues, new features, certificates, and stuff like that. So this is all using the design system, right? Like the buttons, you know, the card, and each of these lists. And you know, we have created the selected state. And so this is the one without selected state, but you can enable it like this. And we want to make sure that anything that can be a component should be a component, including the nested components, right? So even if we have a list like this, and you go to the main component, and this is where you make the change that will apply to every single instance of those designs. And let's say you want to make this circle bigger in the future because at some point you realize it's too small, you can do so, and it's going to apply everywhere. And we have these also, you know, nested components. So if it's not a color or a, you know, rounded corners or a drop shadow, you want to be able to change the icon easily. So for example, I can say, okay, well, I want to change the icons to image, right? So you can do so by using nested components. And I can go to the main component of that, and I can see I have a list of icons that were already created for me. And so I can use from that list from my design system. So it goes very deep and very deep into the whole flow of, you know, so I can return to my instance and click here. Oh, it does not go back to my, so it doesn't remember the nested return to instance. That is interesting. But that's how we work. You know, we want to make sure that at, you know, on the second or third week, designers can start, you know, like we want to make sure that every instance of all of those layers that we are creating will be reusable. And, you know, some of these rules have to be enforced, by the way. Like, it's not going to happen magically. You have to constantly nag them, like, hey, you know, like, please use this as an instance. Please use this as an instance. Like, every single thing, because at the very beginning, you're going to start the design without components. And at some point, you're going to have to replace everything by components. And so it's very important to enforce these rules in your team. So yeah, Surya, again, early designer, and also Aksan, which is who's also an early designer in terms of UI. You know, she's been doing our awesome mockups, and you know, like, she's getting started. This was her first week doing UI design for us. She's been doing the angle mockups for many years, but this is her first week, and she managed to do this. So respecting the design language. Now, people have different strengths, especially for designers. Some of them have a strength in the functionalities. So, you know, but the designers who have graphic design background, they have an easier time dealing with colors, dealing with the aesthetics of the design. So we try to use that strength and you know, and bring that to the design, to the UI design. So one thing we want to do is to allow them to grow and to apply the functionality with the aesthetics, right? Like, design is a marriage of both. It's not just the aesthetics. and it's not just the functionality. It's really designing and creating something that is pretty but also functional. So that she did this, and now she needs feedback on the roadmap UI. So I'm gonna give her feedback, and she also did this awesome component here where we're using the angle mockups, again, all in vector. So what this is useful for is that we're gonna create a system in which every single course, instead of creating a landing page from scratch, we're gonna create a landing page that is reusable in terms of components, right? So if you look at our landing page traditionally, which takes a lot of time, it takes us easily 3 to 5 days to create a new landing page such as this one to present a new course, and everything has to be done from scratch. And I hate it. I hate to have to design from scratch. Sometimes I ask myself, like, is it really worth it to do that? We try to create some of these as components. For example, these tweets can have like a JSON data of all of these tweet data, and then we inject that as part of a component, and it's reusable. But the rest is all created from scratch, right? And so what we try to do in DesignCode 4 is to make it more organic without losing the sort of excitement of creating something new. We're gonna have multiple hero components that's gonna have different styles and this different presentation, but all of the courses will have landing pages. Some of them will have more generic, so some courses are more experimental and less popular, so we don't necessarily want to spend like 3 to 5 days creating a new landing page. So for example, for each extra course here, like SwiftUI 2 versus SwiftUI 1 has sort of like a landing page. Like some of the, like even UI design for developers, we don't even have a landing page because we didn't have enough time. So in DesignCode 4, every single course is going to have a landing page. And here, let me explain a little bit how I'm going about it. First of all, I hate a design that is generic. I as a designer, for me, I don't like the idea that everything is generic. If it's generic, it has to hide that behind really smart decisions on delegating the components and the styling and all that stuff. So let me explain how I'm going about this. So for example, the background of this course, so the gradient here is the same gradient as this card, which means that every single time that I'm selecting a course, it's going to have the gradient of that card. Okay, so that's one decision that I wanted to make, so that not every course is going to have this purple background. But how do I work with the waves, right? Well, I'm using a blending mode, right? And so if I'm changing the color, then the whole wave colors also change. So that's kind of like one example of how I want to make something still interesting and new versus generic and always the same colors. And so that's kind of like the design system and the decisions that you have to make in order to welcome that. So it's really interesting, all the things you can do. Now, speaking about the opacity, so we want to have a good contrast here regardless of the background, right? So if it's blue or anything, so what we did was we created a mask at the top, so you can see a little gradient that is barely visible, but without that it's hard to read here, and you can make it more contrasty or not, but this is great for accessibility. And the same for the bottom part, right? And so that's sort of the decisions that you have to make when you come up with these systems. Now the question is, where do we take this gradient for the card, right? Because the illustration itself is going to come from the card, right? Because all of these have to be inputted in the backend. Okay, so the title, the illustration, you know, the duration of the course, and then when you go to the specific section or the specific course, they have to have their own, you know, they have to get that data, at either it's the gradient or the data like the title and the illustration have to appear here so that it's unique. Now, speaking about this second gradient, what I thought about it, and I thought, well, what if we use something called Css Hue Saturation? For those who don't know what hue saturation is, you can check on Google. And basically what it does is it's going to take a color. So either it's, you know, it's blue, and you can use the hue saturation property to change the angle. And so if you go like to 30 degrees angle, it can change to a pink, but using the same hue, right? So these are the hue of your color. And by changing that, then you can change the hue of your existing gradient, such as purple, right? And then that hue saturation is going to be applied to the card. And for those who want to learn more about colors, like you have like analogous color, complementary color, and monochromatic colors. And so depending on the hue saturation, you can go, you know, to these different, you know, to complement well your main colors. So that's how we wanted to approach it. Now, speaking about the wave, here's another thing that I thought was really interesting, is that, you know, we try to avoid creating too many different things and different techniques and different backgrounds. So if you look at sort of like the first iteration of the design, as a designer, like it takes time to create something and solve problems. But also in my situation, I don't spend all my time designing just because I have to teach most of the time. People expect me to teach new courses. Hey, you know, where's the new SwiftUI course? Where's the new, you know, UI design course? So I can't unfortunately spend all my time like designing. So of course, my design is going to evolve a lot over time, but also it's going to be evolving because of the development process. So oftentimes what's going to happen is that the developer creates something and they're like, hey, this is what I have so far, and I don't like it as a designer. And I realized that, well, what I had in my mind about this being animated or this being kind of aligned in some ways was not properly implemented. And so I thought, well, maybe this blob approach wouldn't fit the skills level of my development team, right? So one thing that you have to be, you know, in order to be efficient in a team, you have to understand the skill level. Now, I'm not saying that to be insulting or anything. I think, you know, for us, it's very, you know, we have to be transparent about like us being early designers and early developers. So when it comes to creating some of these techniques, we can't just like expect them to come up with some crazy 3D rendering using a canvas and stuff like that, which I would love to, but we're just not there yet as a team. And you know, sometimes I'm just super jealous of, you know, Apple and Stripe coming up with these amazing techniques that it would be really, really hard to get there with the skill level that we are at right now. You know, speaking about, you know, like creating an animated transition in CSS that use multiple states like this and create like a flow. It just takes a lot of resources and time, and we just don't have the amount of expertise and the level at which we are right now. And even this globe here, which is using, I believe, the 3GS globe, which is a React library, 3GS globe. And if I'm not mistaken, is this one. and you can like customize everything, and you know, it takes a lot of time to get it injecting you with your data and all that you have to learn the APIs. We just don't have the resources to get there. So back to the problem, we have to be aware of the skill level of our team. And you know, we're not saying that again to be insulting, but we're saying that because it's important to be you know, humble about it, right? Like if you want to grow, you have to know where you are right now and where you can reach, what kind of a jump that you can make. You cannot expect someone who just started coding to do backend, for example, or you know, really complex animation stuff. So you have to start with the very simple, you know, flex layout, or you know, position absolute and relative. So it's very important to make these small jumps. So sometimes as a designer, I make a mistake. You know, sometimes I create like very advanced sort of backgrounds and shapes, and I want to create it, but then I realize I don't have time to animate it. So, and I jump to creating more courses, and then I realize, well, maybe I should look back at the design and sort of redesign some of these things. And so that's kind of where I am, and why I went with this design right here, but still trying to make it interesting and still trying to kind of you know, push the boundaries. Now, let me explain a little bit where I'm going with this. So at the very beginning, I started with, I started with waves, right? Wave is something that I've been doing for a long time. So even DesignCode 3 has that. So, you know, like we have this wave thing, and we're definitely trying to make it more interesting. So it was a single layer of a wave that animates like this, you know, and we wanted to use blending modes. We wanted to use gradients, and then we wanted to make it blend with the background. Okay, so this third layer here is the background, so that it can transition easily to the background. So now, at the beginning we had this. So no, sorry. At the beginning we had this. So the layer, oh, sorry, I can't change the layer blur. So yeah, this is at the beginning we had this, and I thought, well, how can I use a technique that is easy to do, but that can be interesting as well? And so I thought, well, what if I apply a blur on these waves? And then I realized that when I did that, sorry, here, it created some new interesting effects, such as this sort of like space-ish, you know, lighting, and I was quite happy with that. And then I realized also, again, inexpensive technique, right? Anyone can do it. I don't have to go to like reinvent the wheel of a new API and stuff like that to create these things, so that my team can achieve it. The same thing here. So at the beginning we had you know, this wave here, and this is very inspired by the Big Sur waves, and I mean the whole design is very inspired by Big Sur. So you know, I take a lot of inspiration from Apple for sure, but I try to kind of push it and animate it and sort of like coming up with my own flavors. So you know, you can see here without using the layer blur, it's kind of like hard to see whatever text on top or whatever logo on top. So adding the layer blur also allow me to create, you know, an interesting lighting and make the content more, you know, clear in the front. So that's kind of how I went with this. And so we use that technique pretty much everywhere now. So a lot of these waves are actually, you know, a gradient with blur. And so that's what create these amazing kind of like modern, a lot of, let's be honest, a lot of new websites are using this technique. They're using massive blur of like 250, and you know, and that's it. You know, like let me show you the backgrounds here. So for example, super easy to do. It's just a huge background blur on top of anything in the background, right? And it has to be a shape that transition well to the main background, which is off-white. And so you add a massive layer blur of 250 or whatever is the number that works for you, and then it creates this really nice, vibe in the background that that is used as a background for your menu, which has a white color in terms of text. So instead of just making the whole thing white, which is kind of boring, we're just using a gradient that is composed of the waves that we have. So again, we try to be very smart in the way that we use these techniques, because we know the limitations of our skills, and we want to have a lot of impact as well. We don't want to create something that is just a generic design that everyone is doing. We want to come up with new ways that is inexpensive to do. And so that's kind of like the design system that we have right now. So Surya also managed to do that. So, using some of these waves and applying the background blur or the layer blur. And so it makes the text more readable, and it creates this really cool kind of lighting effects and horizon type of gradients. It's really cool. I really like where this is going. And so we also deal a lot with dark mode now. And one thing that I wanted to try was, how do I try to mimic the background sky? So for example, those long exposure photos of the sky in the night, where if you do a rotation, then the stars are gonna have a trail of the light. So I try to mimic that using these shapes. So we're using the stroke options, and we're using the dash, for example, like this, and using different dash values, then we can create very interesting effects. Again, inexpensive. We can easily animate this. So one technique that we wanted to do is to set the animation, right? So one technology or platform that we're using now is Lottie. And so we have someone in our team who actually specializes in Lottie animations and After Effects animations. His name is Dan. He's doing all our promo videos. And so, we can sort of like use these Lottie assets, and he can create these beautiful animations that can be enabled on mouse over or on visible. So in the functionality in React, for example, you can make a Lottie file, an animated asset, be animated only when it's visible to the screen. So for example, let me show you an example. If you go to the Stripe page as an example, right? Because when you design something, you cannot only think about the aesthetics of it. You have to think about different things like accessibility. You have to think about performance. Now, performance is one of those things that requires the implementation process, right? If you think about this animation in the background, it's very heavy, depending on the techniques that you're using. If you're using CSS blur and background blur and layer blur and all that stuff, it's very heavy. So if you animate this all the time, even when you're scrolling, so imagine if that animation is still running while I'm animating this page as well, it's going to be too heavy. So what you end up doing is basically pause the animation when it's not visible. So when you scroll, it pauses it. So you can see the yellow is pause, and when I come back, it resumes. Pause, resume. So it's very important to be aware of these techniques. If you don't do that, your page is going to be very hard to navigate, and it's not going to have the performance expected. So we use this technique with shape.so, for example. there are different ways to go about it. For example, on mouse over, so this Lottie asset is going to be animated if you mouse over it, and you know, this animation here is going to run and pause depending on if it's visible or not. So it's very important to do that. Otherwise, you're gonna have your performance affected. So the same with these Lottie animations that we're gonna have. So you can see that we're applying that to here. So it's gonna have this little retro-ish, you know, rounded squares that's going to be animating in sort of a Johnny Cage Mortal Kombat way. Then, you know, like, it's gonna be really cool. So there you go. You know, like, we're gonna have different of these animations. This kind of like a sky-ish thing, like very SpaceX, or, you know, like rocket launch kind of thing. Even like this dome retro thing, and then the star trailing effect. Again, more star trailing effect using waves. These waves are going to be animated, and I'm still looking into if I should do Lottie, or what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to separate the layers of the waves. So one that is going to be on top, and it's going to transition to the background, and then the second layer, and then the third layer. These can be animated as Lottie, and then as a separate asset, I can apply a CSS layer blur on top of it, and it's going to create this beautiful effect here, but animated. So that's going to be really cool. I look forward to see that. But again, you know, I don't have like a definitive answer if we're going to use it until we implement it. But that's our goal. Our goal is to think about performance, is to think about the ease of implementation, because we have you know, early designers and developers in the team. We have to make sure that they can you know, they can achieve those things. So that's that. I believe there are some questions. Is there a way to work with Figma and WordPress? I'm not familiar with WordPress today. You know, there are so many plugins out there, so you can go to community and you can definitely like search for WordPress, and they don't have anything for WordPress. So, but you know, speaking about design system, you can search for design system. They have like a bunch of plugins for design systems, so that can be interesting. But yeah, this is where we are, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of things that I should be discussing, but I think that's basically it. Now, one thing I want to talk about design systems, and for those who want to ask more questions, feel free to do so. I'm going to take the next 15 minutes answering questions if you have any. One thing I want to mention is about design system, the way you organize these design systems. So in the first iteration of the design, you know, we created a frame that had every single, you know, design system elements. And I realized that instead of doing that, I should be dividing those, you know, those components in its own frames. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that my design system, when my team goes to asset, they can just quickly see a list of buttons that we're using, a list of cards that we're using. We have a lot of cards, so Figma is having trouble, or also because my system is very busy right now. But you can see, if I'm designing a new page, they can just like browse the cards and the components, and it's super neatly organized for forms, icons, illustrations, list designs, logos, and it's neatly organized and well separated is my point. You shouldn't, you know, create a frame for the entire components. You should create separation of those components. So make sure to have one for buttons, make sure to have one for cards, one for icons, illustrations, logos, menu, overlay, list. So those are sort of the main ones that we're seeing ourselves use a lot. And then we're also using auto layout. So this is super important. So if someone is like, okay, I want to create a new button. So this is inevitable. When you create new designs, you're going to have to create new components. So if you look at Syria, who's making a new design, let's say for the updates page, I'm going to have to ask him, hey, Syria, you should probably create a new component for this card here and this card here. And the same for the same for these cards for the downloads page. This should be a component as well. And everything has to be organized. One thing that I see a lot of young designers struggle with is how they organize auto layout. So auto layout is difficult for someone who's never touched CSS or who's never touched SwiftUI, because because it's all about the way you're organizing the spacing between the elements and how you're setting, if it's vertical or horizontal, stacks. And so, we try to use auto layout everywhere. So if someone has like a new button, they just paste right here, and I don't have to worry about the spacing every single time and all stuff like that. So auto layout is super important. These are the lists. And we also want to make sure that we don't have unnecessary structure. Sometimes as you create a lot of auto layout, you're going to have like, useless containers. And we want to make sure that these containers can grow and are necessary. We also want to make sure that every single layer is named, especially on the 3rd, 4th week of your design system. Make sure that everything is named. This is a rule and is not negotiable. So we want to do that. For lists, you want to make sure that there's a selected state, because a list with or without selected state is very different. So this is without selected state. It does not have a padding. And we want to do that to make sure that there's no spacing between the list items. And that's inspired from Design for iPad talk at WWDC and Design for iPad OS pointer, so that there's no wasted space in which you're switching the selected state or the active state. And we need to have the padding so that visually you can have this, because traditionally when you create a list, you implement it and you're making individually some of these elements clickable. So for example, you mouse over this logo, it's clickable, but outside of the logo, it's not clickable. And outside of this title is not clickable. So the description is not clickable, and maybe the handbook is not clickable. But what we want to do instead, again, inspired by that design for iOS and for iPad, we want to make sure that the whole thing is clickable. And this is a modern technique for UI design, because you're going to see that in Mac apps, in iOS apps a lot, because you don't want to have to click that specific logo in your list, right? So if you use a lot of apps on your iPhone, you're gonna see yourself clicking the entire thing and expecting to go to the detail page of that list. So we want to apply the same modern strategy for web as well. So let me give you an example of the music app. And so you're gonna see that every list doesn't have space between the items. And if you go to a list, let me see, new music, for example, you're gonna see the list have different states. And so we have the hover state, and again, there's no spacing between those list items, and there's also a selected state. So we try to be as modern as possible. and we try to design with the practices that can be cross-platform, that can work both for iOS, for iPad, and for the web as well. So it starts with these specific techniques that you see right here, and yeah, like just name everything and organize everything. Okay, so I can answer. So this is the last part, and I'm gonna answer questions. How do you organize your files and project? I believe I kind of went through that, but I can go even more. All right, so first of all, let me explain why I'm putting every single screen in the same page. Well, in DesignCode, in Figma, you're gonna see 4 or 5 people on this file. And it's really, really useful to not have to jump between files. So one of the counterproductive things that I've noticed in my career as a designer is when we have so many files. Remember the Photoshop days? We used to have 20 files over a single design, and we used to name them like final 1, and then final, and then final, and then really, really final. And, at some point you're like, where is the latest file? And so Figma solves that. So that's one thing. And then secondly, at some point when you work, you put everything in Dropbox, and then you always have to communicate where the file is and which file it is. And at least they have the latest file, which is great. But then that's still another problem. And then eventually you get into Pages. So of course, Pages is great. You're gonna have like different pages, one for iOS, one for Android, one for the assets, experiments, and all that stuff. That's also great. But what I think is, at least for the first 4 weeks of your design, you should put everything in a single file, and you should set your design system. You should have everyone come to this file. Everything is always to the latest updates, which means we have developers here. They're gonna come here and they're gonna be looking at the latest change. You don't have to communicate it. You don't have to go to their desk and say, hey, I just updated this thing. No, they don't need to do that. They can just see your cursor. They can go to the version control and maybe make the comparison between different versions of it, and they can sort of look at the comments. So if you have a good system for your comments, they can look at the history of the comments. They can they can ask the question directly, and they can also click on your avatar and see exactly what you're working on right now. I can't show you how it looks like, but try it. Go to Figma, get your team here, and click on the avatar and see what happens. Basically, you're gonna see exactly what they're designing. You're gonna see their screen right away, which is, I think, magical. So for all of those reasons is why we're trying to put everything for the first weeks of design in the same file, and invite everything to the same file, and put all the design system so there's as little back and forth as possible, as little communication as possible, and I think the experience is just beautiful. So we have like these, more specifically in terms of organizing, so we have different pages, and we try to use like a column for a section of pages, if you will. So for example, home, and then we have modals, and then we have anything related to courses. We try to separate the components. So for example, we don't want to always have to have a giant frame for everything. And the reason why this is not good is because you're also limiting creativity. You're also limiting the idea of components, because at the end of the day, you want your design to exist in isolation as much as possible. So you want to be able to use this in any page, or this discount in any page, or this testimonials component in any page. So as a result, instead of creating a single frame for your entire design, which is good for the home page, but in the future, you can use like the hero section separated from the what you'll build section, and then what's included, and the download sections. The same with here. Instead of creating a new page for overview and answers, you're gonna have a component for answers, right? And it's separated. It's easy to navigate to. You don't have to kind of get all of that baggage from the hero section. And so that's how we organize it. In terms of mobile, we try to put the iPad and the mobile. So the resolution for the iPad is 768, and for mobile is 375. This depends highly on what device you're using, so you can test it on your device. But generally speaking, is either 320 or 375. For the iPad, it's generally 768. So the iPad in landscape mode, which means that if it works in landscape mode, it should work also in portrait mode. If it works in portrait mode, it should also work in landscape mode. And so, but these are the main resolution. And the reason why we're doing that is because you have to rewire your brain for each of these platforms, right? So for the iPad, for example, sometimes you have to, instead of having 2 columns, right, you're gonna have 3 columns. And so here we have 2 columns, here we have 1 column, and the font size have to change for the iPhone. So in our design system, we have the text style for desktop, and we have the text style for mobile. And so each of these, so H1 has to be 60 for desktop, and then 34 for mobile. And each of these, so H1, H2, H3, have to have their own equivalent for mobile. And by the way, in code, we also translate that to code. So H1 using style components, which can be embedded into your style component. So I can just include this style component collection of properties that is already using media queries, which means that it adapts to the font size. So for example, H1 for desktop is 60, and then for mobile is 34. Therefore, it is respecting the design system in Figma. So everything has to be translated well, and all of these will be embedded every time that we use it in code. So instead of recoding all of these values from scratch, we're gonna use the const from the style components. So that's how we do it. We're gonna do the same for colors. And we also try to organize like buttons and cards, the same names as we have here. So that's why it's so important to name everything. So button and cards, and if this is called like a pricing card and this is called like a course card, well, the same is going to be named right here. So course card and then pricing card. So how do we pick fonts? I do have a section about that in my UI Design for Developers course, by the way. So if you want to learn more about each of these facets of visual design, I highly suggest, even if you're not a developer, as long as you're interested in the sort of whole flow of design to development space, this is a good course for you. For me, everyone is a designer, everyone is a coder, because we all touch both. Now, if you're a graphic designer, of course, this is not going to interest you at all. But if you are a UI designer and you do a little bit of CSS, a little bit of SwiftUI, then this is a course for you. So yes, in terms of picking fonts, we have different different resources, Google Fonts and all that stuff, and there are so many resources that you can look into that picks the best fonts for you, or have the most popular fonts. Start with those, such as OpenSon, or I honestly, where we are right now, especially if you're focusing on Apple platforms, just use the system font, which is beautiful, created by Apple. It's called San Francisco Fonts, and you have one for Apple Watch, you have one for iOS, and which is roughly the same as for desktop. So don't have to worry too hard. And on top of that, you have to use dynamic type. And this is what I'm trying to inspire from, using dynamic type. Therefore, the text styles that you see that I have in place is basically inspired by the dynamic type for iOS. Now, going even further, which I don't see a lot on the web, is how you can, increase the font size in your settings, in your accessibility settings. So this is what we try to do as well. Since we're gonna use text styles in in style components, we're gonna be able to even set it in the future as a prop. So we can set a settings for dark mode and light mode. We can also set a settings for the font sizes. And the reason why we want to do that, so right now, if you want to increase the font size of a website, you're going to do like Command plus. But the problem with this is that everything is going to be increased. But sometimes you just want to increase the font size and not necessarily the icon size and all of these things. You want the website to make that decision for you. So, this is something that we're looking at, inspired from the dynamic type in iOS, is to only increase the font size and not necessarily the UI size. And the start of that is to create text styles as style components. So that's it. Okay, so is DesignCode free? We have some free courses such as, design system in Figma. We have framework courses that are free, but the rest are paid. The first section, so if you want to see if it's good for you or not, the first section of every course is free. So you can look at it to see if this sounds like a good course for you. And but we have more and more paid courses now, because we realize that this is what allows us to be a team and to create more content for you. Because if we don't charge for these paid courses, then we cannot teach, right? We cannot even create a website like DesignCode for you. And it requires a lot of resources. We have to hire a lot of people. We have to edit all of those videos. We have to pay for all of those promo videos. And we want to things like shape.so as a resource for many icons and illustrations that we're using for the projects. They're all coming from shape.so, which is all developed internally, and it is currently in beta. So if you search for email, you're going to see a lot of these icons, and you can change the colors and the styles. So all of these have to be developed internally, and we use them for DesignCode and we teach it. And it takes a lot of resources, which is why some things are free, but most things are paid, because that's how we can keep doing awesome stuff for you. All right. Is it possible to build a website like this using SwiftUI? Not yet. SwiftUI is not yet made for the web. However, you can definitely build a Mac app now. And honestly, I think this is going to be a new wave of development, where a lot of people who are building iOS apps are going to start supporting a Mac app, because it's so easy to support it by just changing a few lines of code. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm discussing about that at length in my course for SwiftUI for iOS 14, where we're actually building 3 apps at once. We're building the iOS apps, the iPhone app, the iPad app, as well as the Mac app. It's still in the first iteration of it, so it's a bit early. We're still in the beta, but by the September and October is gonna have a lot more sections. I'm gonna go a lot more deeper into the execution of it. But otherwise, iOS 13 is there. We have 60 videos, and it's I think a lot of people. This is actually our top course by a factor of 3x. Our top courses right now are SwiftUI, which receive about 20K views per week, so about 80K views per month. UI design for developers is the second one, and then design system in Figma is the third. So And for UI design for developers, I'm actually adding 12 new sections by next week. So those who have taken the first 16 sections should continue that next week. It's I think you're gonna really like it. So when will the course for UI design will be ready? So like I mentioned before, when I started on SwiftUI for iOS 14, you know, I couldn't finish it, so I was at 16 section. It should be ready for like the 30th video by the end of next week. So this is in active development now, and as soon as I'm done with this, I'm gonna move on to iOS 14 UI design, and I think that's gonna be really fun as well. And then I'm probably gonna move on to React for Designers 2020, and moving on to SwiftUI for iOS 14 again, going to the part 2 and part 3. Any tip on creating the perfect rounded corners? Look, there's no perfect rounded corners. It has to go with the consistency and the platform. So for iOS, if you're designing for, let's say, the iPhone 10, the iPhone 11, the iPhone 12, you're gonna have bigger rounded corners. You know, nowadays people are designing rounded corners based on the rounded corners of the window. So for the Mac, the rounded corners are gonna be less. So you can see the rounded corners have to fit the rounded corners of the Big Sur window. And it's called, in SwiftUI, there's a new name for that. It's called adaptive rounded corners or something like that. Framer has it as well. And this is a new trend. Basically, based on the spacing that you have between the rounded corners that you have here and the rounded corners of your button, you know, the closer it is to the border, the more. So let's say this rounded corner is 10. Well, if there's no padding, then the rounded corners of this button is going to be 10. But if there's a padding of 5, then this rounded corners would probably be 5 or something like that. So it's now called adaptive rounded corners, and that's how you create the perfect rounded corners. Sorry about the long-winded answers about rounded corners, but what can you do? We're designers, we're passionate about rounded corners. For you, which are the top companies that do an excellent job with design system? If Stripe were to create a design system, I would definitely give them sort of like the top marks. I would say Apple has the best design system that I've seen ever, and they have done so for the past 30 years. So iOS design guidelines, just go and look at it. You know, it's so thorough. Everything I learn, honestly, is from Apple. I give them all the credit. The way I am today as a designer is all because of Apple. And so, you know, just read the whole thing. Their color system, their typography system, adaptivity. And you have to understand, it's not coming from a single person. It's coming from a team of hundreds, thousands of designers over a period of 30 years. So they have matured so much. It's, you know, every single company takes cues from Apple. And that includes Stripe, that includes all of these companies that we all respect, you know, Figma or, you know, Sketch, or, you know, all of these design systems that you see here, all inspired from Apple. So if you want to learn about design systems, start with Apple, start with designing for Apple products, you know, iOS, Mac, you know, websites. I look at apple.com all the time. I mean, the ideas that they come up with, it's not just how good it is, but also the fact that they have resources that I can only envy, because I don't have, you know, hundreds of designers that work with me to solve all of these design problems that they have to solve. So, you know, it's hard to not admire what they're doing, and it's hard to not follow what they're doing, because they always make some of the best decisions in the industry. As a result, they're the first one to come up with the best accessibility options. They're the first ones to come with like like the triple tap thing, accessibility, where you can navigate the entire iOS using your voice or using a different voiceover and all of these things. So you have to give them respect for that. And like I give all my credits as a designer to Apple. All right, so can you make a course about how to implement your design system in CSS? So we will have a lot of tutorials around CSS. So in fact, one of the things that we're really actively working on right now is tutorials. And the reason why we're doing tutorials is because they will be complementing courses so well, right? If you look at, I have to admit that as a person, there's a limit to how many courses that I can create and how many resources that I can create. So I rely on my team to fill the gap. And that includes the amazing work that they do for support, video editing, promo videos, landing pages, taking, the design that I have started and making it better. So I rely a lot on my team to kind of fill those gaps. And one of the things that I want to look at is how I can rely on them to create tutorials to fill those gaps, right? Because a course is kind of like an album of songs. It does not, it's more like an experience, step by step. But oftentimes I'm going to be missing a lot of details where people just want to go to that specific song, that specific verse, or that specific word to learn about specific things. And that's where tutorials are going to come in. So we are building a massive amount of tutorials right now about SwiftUI, about Figma, that are not even, some of them are not even covered in the course. Some of them are very basic, such as, the Figma design tool, or the basic tools, or the textiles. And the whole team is working on it, not just me. And that's the magic of it. I want to be able to delegate and fill the gaps so that my team can contribute without having me to try to do everything, because I'm just one person. I can't, it's very taxing for me. And this is a Saturday. I should be spending time with my kids, but I'm spending this hour and a half and 2 hours to sort of try to do this live stream so that I can it's sort of put this knowledge out there, not just for the audience but also for my team, because I try to get them to also learn UI design. But I can't, there's sometimes I have to take breaks, and I spend a lot of I do only 8 hours a day. This is very strict rule for me. I don't want to do more than 8 hours a day. I'm not one of those person who have to constantly work. Even just taking an hour and a half in the weekend for me is I try to limit that as much as possible. But it's enjoyable, and sometimes some weeks I can do it for fun, but most weeks I can't do it. And so as a founder who has to take care of all of these things, have to think through about every aspect of DesignCode. I have to be very smart in the way that we're creating these processes, and help the team of early designers and developers grow and get to where they want to be. So that's kind of where we are right now. And I try my best. So, okay. Xcode 12 is not working well for me. Have you encountered issues? There are definitely issues with Xcode 12. And, feel free to use our support channel. And there's a developer forums from Apple that you can search. You can also go to Twitter and ask questions. Community-wide, you can tag a bunch of people, such as Two Straws, myself, Mark, and there are so many ways. And what I would say is that try to Google it as well. So any issue that you may have, Google it. You're going to find it on Stack Overflow and Apple Developer Forums and Twitter and all that stuff. YouTube is an excellent resource also for learning about some of these things. And so, yeah, that's what I can suggest. What are my thoughts on Framer? Okay, so Framer is a fantastic tool. And the only kind of issue that I have with Framer and why I cannot always teach about Framer is because they change too much. And I like the problems that they're trying to solve is very difficult, and they have done a tremendous work solving these problems. But at the same time, because they've changed a lot, it's very hard to learn once and and sort of apply it for the next 2 and 3 years. But I think their latest iteration is definitely their best, and I definitely want to get back to teaching Framer for sure. But when you have like SwiftUI, which honestly hasn't changed a lot in terms of like code compatibility and tool for the past 10 months, like even SwiftUI 2 works well with SwiftUI 1. It's hard to not pick SwiftUI over Framer at this point, unless you're focusing on the web. So those are my thoughts on Framer. That being said, it's an excellent tool for designers to learn code. It's an excellent tool to collaborate. It's an excellent tool to kind of take your design further and your prototyping further, because their prototyping tool is way better than something that you would have on Figma, for example. Not saying that the one in Figma is not good, but definitely they can do a lot more in terms of complexity, and they have a motion library which is awesome. And yeah, those are my thoughts about Framer. I'm definitely keeping an eye on the tool. It's great, but I wanna come back to it in the next few months. Thank you for the comments. I'm really, really appreciative of all the support. Without you, for the past few years, for the past 6 years, I would not do what I'm doing right now. And honestly, when I got kicked out of the US, had to travel for 2 years, I couldn't follow my dream. I was gonna work for a big company like Apple or startups in San Francisco. I couldn't. So I had to travel for 2 years, and this is what I'm doing now. So I appreciate the support. Now, there's a question. I don't know a lot about your background, but it was scary at first to start your own business and leave a steady 9-to-5 job. It's not that scary if you do it the right way. What I can say is that it's scarier to stay in your current job that you hate, for me at least. So you have to think, what is the cost of moving and what is the cost of not moving, right? Do you feel like you're learning? It's not about how good you are right now, because how good you are right now can change. What is not changing and what should never change is how much you're growing right now, how much you're learning right now. That should never change. And if you feel that you're not growing and you're not learning anything, then the cost of not moving is far greater than the cost of moving to another company or to start your own business. So that's the question that you have to ask yourself. The second thing that you can do is there are different ways to go about this that is less scary. So for example, if you want to start a new business, don't quit your job right away. Do a side project. First of all, first rule, do not work more than 8 hours a day. Okay? Unless you're really passionate about it. This should be your choice. Should not be your employer's choice to say, hey, you have to work more than 8 hours a day. This is not something that I ask my team ever. And it should be their choice. If they want to learn about new things, they can do so, and they should do so. But that should be their decision if they want to grow. Because I do that as well. Like, you know, like in my free time, in my weekends, sometimes I watch WWDC videos, sometimes I watch YouTube videos, sometimes I go on Twitter and I experiment with a bunch of things. So it is my decision. And this should be your decisions as well. So what you should do, first of all, work 8 hours a day. And second of all, whatever is beyond that 8 hours, use that to develop whatever skills you need for your company, for your startup. And it can be a variety of things, but focus on the product. Focus on the audience, on the feedback. So let's say you want to build a new app for, you know, I don't know, self-driving, or maybe not as hard as that, but you know, you want to build a new app that solve a really big problem that you have personally. Shouldn't be too difficult for sure. Start developing it, start learning the technologies behind it, and do that beyond your 8 hours, right? So, you know, like don't be afraid, and use your free time to develop that, and don't quit your job when you feel, and a lot of these revelations don't happen after you quit your job. A lot of these revelation happens during your job, okay? And that's a lot of people, they don't understand that you don't need to be like, you know, without a job and, you know, having no money to rent, and then suddenly you're going to be successful with a new product. No, most often people have already a job, they're already successful at that job, and then suddenly they're learning something new, they're building something on the side, and suddenly they got successful, and at that point they move. And that's how I would go about it. And that's exactly what happened to me. You know, like when I started, you know, writing my first blog post, it happened when I was in San Francisco. Suddenly I realized a lot of people are interested to learn Xcode and to learn Sketch, because I was, you know, like writing a bunch of blog posts about Sketch and Xcode. And I thought, well, this is interesting. You know, like I started building an audience while I was doing the job. And it's also part of your value as at the job, right? Like it doesn't have to be in conflict of your job, right? You can be very valuable to a company and sort of like have a lot of people who follow you. And a lot of people do that. While, you know, a lot of founders are tweeting, a lot of founders are, you know, doing live streams and doing tutorials on the side. And because they have a lot of followers, they have a lot of audience, they bring their success with them to the company that they have joined. And so this is a win-win situation, and you can definitely do that for sure. Yes, I do sleep all the time. You know, if you look at my, you know, my sleep goals, in fact, you know, I keep getting notification on my Apple Watch that says that I fulfill my sleep goals, 7 hours and a half every single day for the past 14 days. So sleep is extremely important to me. You know, I have to be thinking about my health first and foremost, especially at my age. I'm 38 now, so you know, I have, you know, at 35 and plus, you start having back problems. You start to have shoulder problems. You start have you know, vision problems. You don't have a choice. You have to take care of yourself for sure. What do you think about Google's material design? Honestly, I was never bullish about material design, to be honest. The reason why is because I'm not saying that they didn't bring great ideas to the table. They have brought a lot of great ideas to the table. The color system is awesome, but you know, if you look at my designs for the past 7 years, they've always followed Apple first and foremost. Apple always evolve, and they do that steadily over the years. Material design, if you think about it, they were hot in the first few years, and they're still the same, for me at least. They haven't changed a lot over the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years. Apple has changed so much, and the way they're using some crazy techniques. I don't know if you've seen iOS 14, but they're using now gradial background blur, which is insane. They're using so many new gestures. They're using so many new paradigms. So the way you swipe from the bottom now, and you have your bottom card, and you swipe down to dismiss it. I can name like hundreds of these patterns. The way even like the iPhone X gesture has to be completely rethought to make sense for the new phones, and they're the leader in all of those things. So Apple change constantly and they improve constantly, which is why I always look up to them. And material design, was great in the first few years, but I would say they definitely very much in need of like updates right now, in my opinion. And that's my personal opinion, of course. Why use Figma over XD? I would say maturity for sure. Like Figma and Sketch have the most maturity in the design industry right now. They're the first to come up with real-time collaboration. The commenting system, the plugins, and all that stuff. They have the best plugins. 1 year ago, that was not the case, but now I would say they have one of the best plugins platform in any design tool. They have like a very vibrant community. They have a lot of resources now. It's fantastic. Have you tried the new Origami Beta? I haven't, and I've never been a big user of Origami, to be honest, because for me it requires me to rewire my brain too much around what is code and what is Origami. So one of my goals as a designer who code is to close the gap between design and code, and not sort of like go towards a completely different direction, which is what sort of like Origami is doing. They're kind of going more to the visual programming aspect, which makes sense from a logical standpoint, but at the same time, it's not using any code at all, which I try to do. I've always been passionate about code, and I think code is something that again keeps evolving, just like Apple keeps evolving, and I always invest in things that evolves over time. I'm definitely more into the growth of a platform rather than how good they are right now, because the trends can die down. The trends can always, people can always move from one trend to another. But what is never going to die down is the philosophy, the values, and the growth of a platform. And when you see that something is growing, you should invest in it for sure. So, is there a way to create augmented reality UI in Figma? That's a good question. I'm going to search for the plugin. So VR, I guess not. So augmented, nothing. So not to my knowledge. I'm running Figma on Safari and I'm having trouble with the avatars plugin, and it does not work. That seems to be a very specific question. Try the desktop version. I'm using the desktop version, and it's called avatars, and I'm actually using avatars, and it does work for me. So it's installed, and let's say I'm gonna go to I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna run avatars, and it works. So no problem here. Protopie is great. Protopie doesn't really use code, but at least it uses a lot of logic behind the code and also the technologies behind the platforms. So they can use the camera, they can use the gyroscope, they can use variables and all of these things that are very close to code and also close to the logic of CSS and all of these things. So I like Protopie, and it's also very easy to learn. It's very easy to implement. So the way I look at prototyping tools is that if you're a designer that want to stick to design and want to stick to one tool, use Figma and use the prototyping tools in Figma. If you're a designer who wants to do micro interactions and want to do really cool dribble quality and Apple quality micro interactions, use Principle. And you don't want to touch code. If you want to touch code, use SwiftUI. If you're focused on a web, use Framer. So those are the decisions that I would personally make based on your criterias. All right, so thank you. Thank you for the kind comments. I really appreciate it. All right, let's see if there's a last question that I can answer. Is Flutter something to learn? Flutter is great. Flutter is more mature than SwiftUI for sure. Flutter works for web, for Android, for iOS, and Flutter has a growth. So as I mentioned again, I'm someone who likes to invest in growth. So we do have a new Flutter course that is coming out next week with 20 sections, and we already have roughly 19 sections so far, and it's gonna be a total of 23 sections next week. It's taught by Sai, who's in the chat. You're gonna be able to interact with him, and he's doing an awesome job teaching Flutter. Flutter, from all the comments that I read, is growing to exceed React Native very soon, and it's from what I read, is just a better platform for if you want to create, if you care about performance, if you care about the native experience, if you will. I don't know if I can call it fully native, but it's definitely very close to native for sure. But SwiftUI is my personal favorite for sure. Should I stick with Swift and SwiftUI, Apple design? That's depends on your product. What I can say is that Apple is a great platform to invest in for sure. I've invested in Apple for, when I say invest in Apple, I mean in the platform, in the design, in the tools, not in the stocks, but it's just a great platform. All my knowledge, all my success is thanks to Apple for sure. So yes, you should learn SwiftUI. You should learn UI design from Apple for sure. It's one of the best recommendation that I can ever have. How would you react to React Native? Well, React Native and React is very similar, which is why we decided to teach React Native as well, on top of React. And it's a good platform. It's good if you have this sort of web mentality. And by web mentality, I mean like you're building your app kind of like the same way you're building a website. You're gonna notice when you're gonna touch SwiftUI that the mentality is very different. Not in the execution. The execution is very similar to React Native, but the mentality of building a native app is very different. The controls that you have, the SDK and the APIs that you're using, the patterns, the UI patterns, the guidelines, the dark mode, light mode things, the dynamic type things, all of these amazing things that I'm actually applying to my website back that I never learned in React Native, but rather in SwiftUI. So yeah, like it's a completely different mindset, and you should give it a try before judging it. Try SwiftUI. It's a very different mindset, different tools, different principle, guidelines. Can I quickly explain the Big Sur gradient? Okay, that's a good question. Okay. We're gonna go to the live stream. So this is the live stream page, and this is definitely inspired by the Big Sur gradient. It's not that complicated. Really, you have to create a rectangle, and then you have to use the bend tool, and then you're gonna move it like this. Okay, and then you apply the gradient. So let's say this one, and then you're gonna create a new layer. You're gonna bring it to the back, use the Bezier curve, and then you're gonna move it around again like this, duplicate it, bring it back, do it again. Now I'm simplifying it. Of course, you can add more points like this. And one thing you want to do is make sure that you're setting mirror angle and length. That's super important. And the reason why is because you want this sort of curve to be perfect as much as possible, right? Like this. Without the mirror, it's gonna look like this, which is super weird sometimes. If you do it wrong, it's gonna look weird like this. So you want to add more points, and you want to add more waves, and you want to add different gradients using the same colors. So at this point, you can just use the same colors as these ones. So that's basically how you would do it. And you know, I explained a little bit about the layer blur technique. So for example, okay, so let's say I'm gonna have different colors because I don't have the same gradients. But you know, let's say you're gonna have one of those layers to be using a layer blur, and that layer blur should be about 250. And now you have this awesome gradient that you can put on top or at the bottom, and you can move it around. So that's it. Kind of like a simplified explanation of how I did that. Now this looks weird, takes time, of course, but the technique is how I did it. And also don't forget the last wave that is going to transition from, you know, masking your wave to the background of your website. So that's super important as well. So let's see if we have last question. I think that's it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this live stream. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed, please give it a like. This, you know, if I see that people like this live stream, I'm gonna do more for sure. I'm gonna teach more stuff. So it means a lot, and I'm definitely hoping to get to 30K subs and to provide more content. All of these live streams are going to be on DesignCode with the 4K format. So on YouTube is at 1080p, but on DesignCode we have the live streams, and in DesignCode 4 we have like a live stream tab on top of that. And you know, we have this awesome profile for instructors now, where you're going to be able to see the latest from Mang, and you're going to be able to see the latest live stream that I put out there, the latest course sections and the latest tutorials that I wrote personally. And I think that can be really useful. But live stream is one thing that I want to do because it's an experience. I can interact, I can answer questions, I can, you know, like talk about specific things that it's very hard to insert in a specific course. So this is, I think, can be useful. And of course, I need your feedback. If you like it, if you don't like it, if I should focus back on courses, please let me know. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.